Okay, so first of all, I am Sean Millman, again, a third-year percussion doctoral candidate here at NYU Steinhardt. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for listening. My research explores a connection between the expert performance, organizational behavior, and culture of a college athletic team and of a college music performance studio. Both environments consist of young adults with proven ability in a real-time craft with no skill ceiling, multiple coach-mentor figures guiding them toward a goal, and varying degrees of cooperation. Because so much of the writing around college athletics is found in the business discourse, I'm looking into applications from business as well. I will show that significant elements within the fields of college athletics and business can be applied toward more effective operation of collegiate music performance programs, both in terms of outcomes and day-to-day activity. I plan to use the collegiate percussion area as an example application. The percussion setting of this research is going to be descriptive rather than restrictive. I'm going to use it to show findings, not to limit myself to just the percussion area. It's very common for coaches and business leaders to claim transferability of a concept to other sports or market sectors, regardless of domain-specific application. This transferability or versatility of ideas, I think, transfers within music performance in a very similar way. So what we have here in the top left is Bob Van Cise. He teaches at Peabody, Yale, and Curtis. And in the top right, that's Paul Rennick in front of the Santa Clara Vanguard drumline. If you ask anybody within the drumline community, they'll pretty much agree that he's basically the greatest drumline coach to ever live. The bottom left, this is Billy Donovan, formerly of the University of Florida, now with the Oklahoma City Thunder in the NBA. And the bottom right, that's Mike White. Both these guys obviously was players. He's the current head coach at the University of Florida, where I did my bachelor's and master's. And during my master's, I became really involved with the athletics side of things, as first a student volunteer and then later on even an employee. And what I realized through being invited to watch practices from these guys is that the way that they run their programs, I think, can be very beneficial toward what we do in the percussion field that sometimes looks very different and sometimes I think looks very similar. So the reason I'm looking at business as well as athletics is that a significant portion of writing about athletics, as well as my subfields of expert performance, organizational behavior, and culture, exist within the business discourse itself. The field includes a robust discussion of team dynamics applicable to the collegiate music environment. Issues like budget, organizational behavior, goals, and especially personnel management directly translate to the responsibilities of the college studio director, additional faculty, and students, or performers in training. By examining and applying select practices from athletics and business, my research will offer new methods and perspectives on music performance training in the collegiate environment. Through literature analysis and targeted interviews with college coaches and athletics administrators, I'll make connections and draw conclusions targeted specifically for the musical community. Since the nature of interpersonal dynamics is so interwoven with competitive success within athletics and within business, coaches and business consultants and business managers and leaders are necessarily very well versed in issues relating to teams. Both athletics and business have discipline-wide dialogue surrounding team dynamics that can be applied directly to the team environment of the collegiate instrumental or voice studio. The paradigm I'm working with sees the studio director as head coach or CEO, additional faculty or adjuncts as assistant coaches or executives, and music students as athletes or employees. This application of interpersonal dynamics within the pursuit of achievement toward the college music studio environment will inform both teaching methods and program organization, and will similarly provide performers in training ways to maximize their return on investment, get the most out of their college music education. And another key need for this study is a widespread need within trained, especially classical musicians, for better high-level preparation methods. We're seeing a small subfield pop up of training and lessons around classical musicians for highly motivated classical musicians who are looking for orchestra jobs in that extremely competitive audition landscape. So we're going to get to some examples of this in a second, but we're seeing students graduate from music school, whether it's their undergrad or graduate school, and they know how to play their instrument, they know their instrument's history, they know their instrument's repertoire, they're supposedly ready to go. And then they go out there and they determine, I want to be an orchestral musician, and they try to prep for these auditions. They realize they don't know how to, that their college music performance training has not given them that specific training. And again, we know this because these musicians are asking for and paying for help with audition training, even though they know how to play their instruments. So, my research questions. My primary question is, what principles can college music studio professors use from the fields of collegiate athletics and business to enhance their programs? And my sub-questions, how does the coach-athlete relationship relate to the teacher-student relationship within the context of musical training? What principles from sport and business research can be applied to recruitment, training, and retention in the college music studio, especially in audition processes? 3, and we're going to get to some details on 3 because I've already seen some questions about this one. How can the collegiate music studio implement an approach prioritizing character and personal development before performance improvement? 4, how can collegiate studio directors apply principles from these disciplines in time management within their programs? And 5, how can principles from these disciplines create a high-performance culture within a collegiate studio? First component of this study is going to be extracting concepts applicable to music performance from the relevant literature. The primary 3 fields are percussion, business, and athletics. Again, percussion as an example, not a restrictive that my findings are only going to be relatable to percussion. And my secondary fields are health and human performance, expert performance, and performance psychology. These findings are going to funnel into a 2-step process of application of determining what elements from business and athletics can transfer, what could potentially apply, and which of those are beneficial. And then the second component will be semi-structured interviews with NCAA Division I head coaches and administrators. Coaches obviously being more the athletic side of things, administrators being more the example of business side of things. Once I started my master's at Florida, I've cultivated relationships with several coaches and administrators there that I intend to interview. I'll be creating separate interview protocols for coaches and administrators, and analyzing and coding them according to the version of Carol Gilligan's listening guide that's taught here in Steinhardt by Naomi Way and Joseph Nelson. Okay, so moving into the lit review. So within the percussion discourse, this is the current cover of Percussive Notes, which is kind of the most common source for percussion publications. At the top, that's Nancy Zeltzman, a marimba soloist. In the middle, that's Steve Smith. Classic rock fans may know him as the drummer for Journey. And at the bottom, that's the Blue Devils drum line, and their coach with his back to the camera is Scott Johnson. This, again, is the main source for percussion publications. It's not a peer-reviewed journal. It tends to read more like a magazine for professionals. It does have a running dialogue about best practices in managing collegiate percussion programs. So in athletics, and I use this picture very specifically. That's Tim Walton. He's the current head softball coach at the University of Florida. That's Kirsty Merritt. She's currently a professional softball player. She's been invited to try out for the 2018 U.S. Olympic team. This picture I chose specifically as an example of the coach-athlete relationship. And I don't know about the other performers in the room. I've seen this very rarely between a musician and a mentor for a musician. So, peer-reviewed athletics content is generally published within business or psychology journals. Jeff Noble has said, quote, over 70% of the variance regarding autonomous coaching environments is explained by factors other than gender, type of sport, and academic classification of student athletes. This claim that the culture of a coaching environment is largely independent of a type of sport, to me suggests that it can be independent of sport itself. So I'm looking at music performance not as something entirely different in kind from this group of sports or sport, but more as a different sport within the broad field of several different sports. Brett Ledbetter is a performance coach who has interviewed dozens of championship college coaches in various sports, and this is where my third research question was really born, the one about the one about character over results. Ledbetter found when he interviewed these coaches that rather than focusing entirely on results, which in athletics is wins and losses, they focused primarily on building character within their players and then using that character to feed into a process driving improvement and then allowing results to happen almost as a byproduct rather than focusing on results constantly. So by reframing their focus, they've been able to improve the entire culture of their program. Other works in this field examine the coach-athlete relationship and behavior of athletic directors as predictors of effectiveness. That is the current cover of the Harvard Business Review. One subfield of the business discourse is organizational culture. It refers to the interpersonal dynamics and expectations within a group of people operating together over a substantial period of time. I'm also using works from CEOs of multinational corporations to show applications of these concepts at scale. There's a wealth of writing within business about these sorts of culture and process, how do we achieve something together ideas. This is K. Anders Ericsson, and yes, that is the best picture I could find of him. He is the leader in the expert performance discipline. This field explores what sets high-achieving performers apart from others in their domains, and music and sports are very standard and well-documented areas of study. He's somewhat famous for doing a study on Berlin. I shouldn't use the city if I'm not sure about it. On a conservatory in Europe and determining which process elements set apart the best players in a given conservatory from everybody else. Ericsson argues against the role of innate talent and emphasizes instead what he calls deliberate practice. We'll get to more on that in a second. There is a group of scholars who disagree with this view, led by Brooke McNamara, that claim essentially that deliberate practice isn't enough to explain the differences between the very best people and everyone else. Jason Haheim of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, who also teaches here at NYU, teaches a course about auditions in the spring. He has said, quote, he has said about deliberate practice that it is a, quote, framework for improvement that experts will attest to across fields as far-ranging as tennis, neurosurgery, chess, corporate leadership, theoretical physics, orchestral music, Jeopardy, and number memorizing competitions. I use that quote not only because I love the way that Jason talks about this, and I've taken this class twice, but also in that quote he mentions sports, business, and music performance. And then performance psychologists Don Green and Noah Kageyama have applied these sorts of expert performance and performance psychology concepts to music performance in the context of auditions. And Kageyama is actually collaborating with another percussionist from the Met, Rob Knopper, this winter to create an online audition process course that's very expensive for orchestral auditioners of all instruments. This is an example of what I was talking to about before, where people are graduating from music school, they know how to play their instruments, but they're not quite sure how to prep for a high-intensity audition. Rob Knopper and Noah Kageyama are one example of people who are teaming up to try to provide that service that a lot of musicians feel like isn't being taught to them in their college environments. Okay, so by way of limitations, this study is going to limit conclusions to potential applications in the study of music performance in the college, university, or conservatory environment. I'm not looking at summer festivals or things like drum corps or anything like that, just within the college environment. And it will consider both individual and group pursuit of excellence, so things like lessons, auditions, and solo performances, and then things like rehearsals and orchestra performances, looking both at group and individual things. And one last note, I'm fully aware that music is not a sport, because I've gotten pushback on that from many, many musicians. I'm not trying to say that it is. My focus is on recognizing and applying elements of culture and process from these two outer disciplines of college athletics and business toward what we do as musicians. I'm not attempting to make the claim that shooting free throws or increasing market capitalization are fundamentally the same task as woodshedding a xylophone excerpt or playing in an orchestra. That being said, I'd like to thank everybody for listening and open it up for any questions.
Questions? I agree music is not a sport. It seems like the big difference between like music and these other activities is that you can objectively define success in all of these other activities, whereas for music, like excellence seems like it's pretty much subjective.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed as I spent more time listening to high-achieving college head coaches and observing their practices is they actually, even though they have this built-in barometer of wins and losses, would tend to disagree. The more you hang out with these guys, especially at the Division I level who have won championships or want to, which is everybody, they'll win games and say, you know what, we didn't play very well. Or they'll go into practices the day after they just won a really hard-fought game and say, yeah, we're doing all of these things wrong. And you'll hear a lot, especially within, again, great coaches who have won championships, that you're not actually competing against the next competition that you're going to play, but you're competing against yourselves to make yourselves better. That over the course of, for instance, take a college basketball team that plays generally 2 games a week in season starting in about 2 weeks. They'll spend about 4 hours a week actually in a competitive game. A college basketball game lasts about 2 hours. Then they spend about 20 hours doing other various college basketball related things in practice and lifting weights and watching film and that sort of thing. And all those other 20 hours, it's just about individual and group improvement of that team. And then yes, there's watching film on the next opponent. Yes, there's putting in specific place for how to attack them. But the focus is all on improving themselves. And then wins and losses sort of serve as a barometer to see how they're doing, rather than an extrinsic, this is how good we are model. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah.
So sport is very broad in terms
Yes.
of things that include, let's say, team exercises, where a lot of it is about interaction, and there's other sports where it's almost entirely either opponent-oriented or individual effort.
Yes.
And music has also got that breadth. Would you consider focusing in on some range of it in order to have maybe a smaller breadth to cover in terms of coaching techniques or emphasis or style? Because right now this is a very large amount of information to try to integrate.
Yeah, that's a question I've gotten before. The individual and group differences, to me, I think are potentially important because, not to speak for the other musicians in the room, but I think, or the other performers in the room, I think every performer would admit that there's a duality of roles, that we need to be able to operate in the individual and we need to be able to operate in the group, and that without, with a method applied to only one of those, like for instance the expert performance stuff generally is applied to individuals and it tends not to be applied to teams or orchestras or anything at scale. And with respect, I think that tends to be a hole in that literature, because now you're talking about how to create great golfers or great singles tennis players, or for instance, great violin soloists and not great orchestras or great football teams. So I think the duality of how we manage these kinds of processes between individual and group, I think is very important. Also, to go back to basketball, you think, or baseball is a great example too. You think about a guy at the plate, he's performing an individual competition, right? Just him and the pitcher. And then once the ball is hit, if there's somebody on base, now it's a group activity. Music tends to have those moments as well, where all of a sudden you're playing a solo and then somebody else comes in. So I think these individual and group things, they can be separated. I'm not sure that they should. Yeah.
I want to say this is very exciting to me, because I see the parallels that you're seeing in the athletics and the instruction. And personally, I've just taken over a theater program at a public high school in New Jersey that's in decline, with an administration that's looking at building it through competition. And they have a very, very vibrant sports program. They've had it since the high school was founded in 1991. So you give me a lot of ideas to go.
Great.
And follow to kind of talk with some of these other administrators and even the athletic programs, and even the marching band I see works very well with the football team. So thank you for that. There's two things I wondered about. I think not being in music education, I wondered if there was a standard curricular structure or approach to how music studio performance training would be that this would be compared to. And then also you had mentioned administration of a program. I wondered if there was also a curricular or an instructional element to what you're looking at too, or are the two terms, can you use the two terms for the same thing?
Yeah, so I'm hopeful that my findings are going to look like recommendations for college studio professors into ways that they can improve these elements of their programs, to maybe lessen the need for instance, college music performance graduates to have to go out and then spend another 2 years looking for a percussionist at the Met to teach them how to take an audition, right? To sort of fill those gaps. So in terms of, is there an existing curriculum? If there is, I haven't seen it. I think there's, at least within my home discipline of percussion, there's giant disagreements about what should be part of the curriculum, what shouldn't. Different places that you go will emphasize the marching band component or the playing in Broadway shows component or the orchestra component, and there's all these different sorts of cocktails of which elements matter. So there's a discussion about curriculum, but there's no real agreement about what it should be. I would hesitate to make a recommendation and say this is what the curriculum should be, as much as to say based on these two disciplines of athletics and business and then the sub-disciplines that kind of bind them together. here are some issues that we can think about. So whether when you're in New York and trying to play on Broadway is something a lot of your students probably care about, here's ways that you can apply that to that. And when you're teaching in LA and trying to play in, film studios is something that a lot of your students care about. Here's how you can apply it to that. And then when you're teaching in Texas and drum lines matter a lot more, you can apply it to that. So less so trying to create a curriculum than present issues so that based on whatever context a given program exists in, they can apply it to operating better where they are.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think my thoughts are pretty much in line with what has been said already. I'm not so familiar with the percussion world. Speaking from my field, like in jazz, for example, there's not a homogeneous teaching canon. It's very, very individual. Maybe it's different in your field. I don't know.
It's not. It's
yeah. And
varies.
I would also, and the same thing, like there are different kinds of sports and different, and even like within like the objectives in music are very different. If you maybe go for like an orchestra position, you have passages to prepare. It's a very different thing than finding your artistic voice, right? So I don't know, like obviously you thought more about this than me, but I was thinking maybe it would make sense to have like maybe 2 case studies in a way that you have like, okay, I don't know, the NYU jazz curriculum, the NYU percussion curriculum versus I don't know, NBA team here or something. That to me would sound a lot more focused in a way, because I also feel it's very broad at this point.
It is very broad. And at present, that's sort of intentional because there's so many of these things that I think play into each other. Like these issues of looking at process and looking at culture that I think are my 3rd and 5th sub-questions. I've gotten several questions about this that say, well, are you more interested in process or are you more interested in culture? If you talked to a Division I head basketball coach, they would say you can't separate the two. That your process is defined by your culture and your culture is going to lead into your process. So a lot of these things are very large issues that within college athletics are one very standard and accepted way of doing things that, whereas in music we're having these conversations about how do we look at these things. If you get the 14 men's basketball coaches in the SEC together, for example, they're not going to have a conversation about whether to do these things. They're going to have a conversation about how they're going because they all know that these are all important things of being able to be competitive and effective at what they do. So yes, it's broad and there are several large issues, but I think they're all so intertwined in athletics and also, as I've been doing reading in business, in those fields too, that if you take them apart, you're going to be missing significant elements of how these things work. Yeah.
First of all, congratulations on getting to this milestone. It's been interesting to see how this topic for you has grown from dissertation proposal seminar to this. What I'm wondering though is, while I appreciate your focus on performance psychology, for example, and like team learning, I'm wondering why, or rather, was it intentional to kind of disregard like exercise physiology and motor learning skill acquisition?
I haven't disregarded that.
Okay.
Health and human performance and that sort of thing is one of my subfields. I've reached out to a Dr. Elliot Cleveland who finished, I think, at Clemson, he's a physical therapist who works primarily with marching percussionists, but also with other percussionists. And one of the things that we talked about was if you watch a football team on Saturdays, you'll see an army of physical therapists out there, and when somebody gets hurt, you'll see 2 or 3 guys run out there. There's a cart out there, there's EMTs ready to go, and when you watch and they're there for practices, they're there every time that team engages in football activities. When you watch a marching band rehearse, there's no one. There's 1 or 2 band directors, there's, at the college level, generally graduate assistant staff, and there's no medical representative there at all. Now, basically nothing is, outside of combat, is as potentially damaging to the human body as playing football. But there are injuries sustained within the marching arts,
Sure.
and we are not including that. So that is an element of this. It's just not something that
If I might interrupt there, though,
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily as, I wasn't necessarily referring to the like effects of injury or the mitigation of injuries, but rather within subspecializations such as like motor skill acquisition, motor skill acquisition, that might kind of clue you in as to how people can master their craft as you were talking about, from a perhaps more objective perspective.
Okay.
And I think that I mean, look, I'm, you know, in terms of like vocal health, I appreciate the injury aspect, but I think it would be really beneficial for your study to focus on things in health professions that actually improve performance rather than mitigate injury.
Okay. Yeah, as yet, things like motor skill acquisition have been outside the scope of the study, but